Good morning, everybody. Good evening. Greetings. I'm Nick Platt, Chairman of the USET, U.S.-China Education Trust Advisory Board. And I'm delighted to welcome distinguished participants from China, India, and the U.S. to USET's third virtual webinar discussion. This one is on the new geoeconomics of Asia. As a member of the traveling staff during President Nixon's 1972 visit to China and the head of the political section who opened the US liaison office in Beijing in 1973, I have had firsthand knowledge of the value of direct discussions between the US and China for almost 50 years. My most recent contacts have included an exchange between USET and the Communist Party of China Party School in Beijing. And I'm a firm believer in the value of staying in touch, particularly when the relationships are in flux. Now, I see a big shadow falling down on my necktie, and I'm just going to have to live with that, I guess, because the sun is just coming up. Anyway, the first discussion of today's Trilateral webinar covered the changing global order and regional governance. The second dealt with maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. Today we are going to examine the impact of China's Belt and Road Initiative on the different countries. And we're going to get their geoeconomic visions for the region and converging interests in protecting sea lanes of communication and navigation, trade and investment, global supply chains, and infrastructure will also figure into the discussions. We'll be guided by a distinguished panel today. Dr. Rakesh Mohan, President, Center for Social and Economic Progress, formerly of Yale and the IMF, will give the Indian perspective. And let me say right here how upset and concerned we are by the stage of the pandemic in India. All of our sympathies and support go out to you. Yu Hongjun, former Vice Minister, International Department of the CPC Central Committee, will represent the Chinese point of view, and Bob Zellick, Robert Zellick, with deep experience in State Department, High Office in USTR, the World Bank, and the White House will present the US side. I'm now going to hand over to Jia Jingguo, my colleague from China and a long time interlocutor with USET. And I'm so glad to see him again after a long period of deprivation. So, Professor Jia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Platt. It's a great honor for my institute to work with the U.S. Education Fund Trust and also the Zhao Suishen's Institute in Denver. Many thanks to the distinguished participants, and many of whom are my old friends, to accept our invitation to participate in this important event. Nowadays, I think it's fashionable to talk about strategic competition. I do not like the term competition because it only addresses the one aspect of international relations, and it left out cooperation. However, if compete we must, I would rather use benign competition rather than malign competition. By benign competition, I mean competition to do better oneself rather than competition to undermine the other side. Benign competition is supposed to have 4 characteristics. First, it does not regard, or the participants do not regard each other as a necessary evil or as an evil entity. Second, they compete to see who can do things better instead of compete to make sure the other side cannot do things. Third, competition is about to compete with decent means rather than indecent means. And finally, benign competition does not lead to lose-lose situation. At least, it can be a win-win situation, or it can be a win or lose situation, depending on the circumstances. Malign competition is just the opposite. In a malign competition, the parties regarding each other as evils. Its aim is about undermining each other. And in competition, it adopts the principles of the end justifies the means. And it usually ends up with lose-lose situation. Will the future China, US, India competition be benign or malign? This is the question that we may explore. I think the 3 countries should do whatever they can to avoid malign competition and embrace benign competition. And I hope we find ways to have a benign competition ultimately. Talking about economic relations, it's quite popular nowadays to talk about self-reliance and self-sufficiency. This is the case in all of our 3 countries, I think. Many argue that this is the best way to ensure our security in the age of technological progress, Internet of Things. This is the basis for the argument for policy of decoupling or partial decoupling. I think many people in all 3 countries share this view. However, the more I think about it, the more I think it is not going to work. We are in the age of globalization. For decades, globalization has made the world much more prosperous, more peaceful, and even more equitable in terms of distribution of wealth, according to some studies. Are we going to give up all this in the name of security? I don't think so. The reason we engaged in globalization in the past was not because we were not aware of the security risks in doing so. We were fully aware of the risks, such as economic dependence on others. However, we overcame the fear and embraced globalization because we realized that benefits of globalization can bring us, bring to us far outweigh the risks it entails. Today, with the arrival of new technologies, this issue is back again, and that has led many to favor economic decoupling. Personally, I think the best way for us to do is not economic decoupling, because it would deprive us of the benefits of globalization and make the world less safe a place to live. The best way probably to cope with this problem is reassured interdependence. That means that we can each focus on doing things we can do best in in certain areas of the economy or in certain parts of the supply chain and make it indispensable for others. This helps us to deter others from blackmailing us, while ensures us to continue to enjoy the fruits of interdependence or globalization. These are just a couple of thoughts I have been thinking about, and I wish to share with you in the hope of provoking some discussion. Once again, it's great to see my old friends and also to get to know some new friends. And I hope that our workshop, our conference, will be a great success. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Teresita Schaefer. I'm a special advisor to USCET. In my former life, I was a US diplomat, served as ambassador to Sri Lanka and served all over South Asia, but never had the pleasure of serving in China. It is my pleasure to introduce the presenters, and then I will moderate what I'm sure will be a lively discussion if the previous two seminars are any guide. So let me start with Dr. Rakesh Mohan, one of the most distinguished economists in India, with many years in senior government positions, and as Ambassador Platt already told you, has spent time at Yale and at the IMF and is now heading up a think tank in Delhi. Rakesh, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tacey, for honoring me by including me in this discussion, something I think that we need to do more and more in Asia. It's a real pleasure to be in this. Thank you, Ambassador Platt, also for the invitation. And it is indeed a great pleasure for me to be included and to have this discussion. I have to start by mentioning the ongoing COVID-19 health crisis in India, which Ambassador Platt kindly mentioned. It is indeed an ongoing human disaster that we are going through, and everything that can be done to reduce the pain here is very welcome. Just to give you an idea to all the participants of the kind of spread of the virus right now, is that about 14 of my 38 staff members in the think tank I had have indeed got COVID right now. So the spread is very wide and is near just about anyone that one happens to know or meet. So these are really very difficult times. I have also, just going into the issue of Asia, the new geoeconomics, what is most striking to me just in this context is how low the infections and deaths have been in Asia east of Bangladesh, almost every country. There is a bit of a second wave, third wave going on in some countries, but nothing like in India or in Europe or Latin America or the United States. So there's something that they have done. They know that we don't. So I think I must start by saying that Asia itself must have a lot of lessons on the current crisis that we are going through. And it is remarkable that in so much of the millions of pages being written, one sees very, very little, if anything, written on this issue on why Asia has escaped the big scars of the epidemic. Okay, so let me start. I'm going to take a somewhat, in some sense, wider view of the new geoeconomics of Asia. Let me start by saying that the world is really on the cusp of an epochal change in the global economic power, not really seen since for the last 250 years since the Industrial Revolution. Particularly rapid change since the beginning of this century, just the last 20 years. And to some extent, I think it's because of this incredibly rapid change just the last 20 years. Just to give a couple of figures, that the G7 weight in the global economy in terms of PPP GDP was around 44, 45% in the year 2000, is now down to something like 25, 30%. And the BRICS, just to take contrast, BRICS countries in the year 2000 were just about less than 20% of the global GDP in PPP terms. Now there's nearing 35%. So the BRICS countries today are about equal to or higher than the G7 put together. Just mention this to make the point that this change has been so rapid, and most of this change, of course, most of change in weight is really from Asia. Um, and I make this point to illustrate or to focus on the fact that it is therefore not surprising that this kind of rapid change is almost unprecedented, probably in the history of the world. And therefore, it's not surprising that in terms of behavior, political and economic strategies, global economic governance, the world is just really struggling to adapt to this new reality of the world. Also, the large increase in share of the emerging and developing economies as a whole is actually now greater than the advanced economies. So something has happened just in front of our eyes the last 20 years. And most of this, of course, has taken place in Asia. That is China plus ASEAN plus South Asia, almost 400 billion people. And therefore, after 200 years, the center of gravity of the global fulcrum or the global center of gravity of the global economy is shifting back from the Atlantic Ocean to somewhere in the Indian Ocean. And this will obviously change geopolitics, geoeconomics with these shifts in ways that we probably can't even foresee right now. And that is why I think that this discussion is very important in trying to get a grip of the changes in geoeconomics. Now, one note of caution in the sense that the last time this kind of power change took place was about 100 years ago, from around just the beginning of the First World War. But we have to remind ourselves that the change from the UK plus Europe being the top dogs in the world, both economic sense as political sense, strategic sense, military sense, to the United States took two messy world wars and the Depression. It didn't happen very smoothly. And that was just between Western Europe plus the UK and the United States. So we will all have to collectively work hard in the kind of way of, I would say, benign cooperation rather than benign competition, as Professor Jha just mentioned. And there was going to be a struggle so that all of us have to be particularly conscious of this kind of change taking place. Now, over the next decade or so, the Asian economy, including, as I said, China, ASEAN, Korea, Japan, and South Asia, will be larger than the US and Europe combined within the next 10 years at some point, probably by the end of the decade. But three caveats. Still, the GDP per capita of China would be much lower than US or Europe. So that's one area of imbalance. The financial sector in Asia is still very weak relative to the West. Here, of course, the United States is the leader, and that will remain for quite some time. A third, US military power will remain much higher, despite the increases taking place in Chinese military power, at least over the next decade, if not longer. So whereas the overall economic situation is clear, there are some other imbalances. The US domination in the science technology will remain, but there China is catching up rapidly. Some numbers put out, collected by my former colleague, former president of Yale, Rick Levin. The Chinese, of course, R&D as a proportion of GDP is now higher than the US, and it's higher in absolute terms. Chinese patents per year are now about 1.5 million or so a year, whereas the US is around 600,000 a year. Of course, there may be differences in the quality of those patents, but nonetheless, the numbers are staggering. Similarly, the science and engineering graduates of China now about 1.5 million per year, compared to about 300,000 or so in 300,000, 350,000 in the US. So on science technology, even though I think that the US, I think most people would agree the US will maintain its lead, there's a rapid catch-up going on. And by the way, this is also happening rapidly, not just in China, but Korea, Singapore, and others. 60 to 75 by different kind of projections, including by the McKinsey Global Institute, about 60 to 75% of incremental GDP and trade growth over the next 20 years will come from Asia. So this is a summary in some sense of this huge geoeconomic change that we are all going through. Now, there will be many challenges, a lot of tensions, of course, that will arise from this. It will not be an easy transition, it will be uneasy. There will be uneasy balance. And we can already see the consequences of some of these tensions. The emergence of the Quad, which of course India is a member, is a signal element of the attempt of the United States to maintain and retain its influence as it has had over the Indo-Pacific area for the future. It could possibly expand to other spheres apart from just the strategic military sphere. Could attempt possibly, I don't know, but could possibly attempt to encompass the ASEAN countries in the region also in this attempt. So there will be tensions that will be caused by these changes. Trade tensions we're all familiar with in the recent past between the US and China, between other countries in China, including ourselves, India and China. Europe can't quite make up its mind in terms of what kind of tensions it wants on trade with China, given the very strong interrelationships between them. As was just mentioned, there are attempts to close borders in different ways to do self-reliance. I agree with Professor Jha that this is not advisable. The world has gained tremendously. India, I want to make it very clear, has gained tremendously by our opening in the last 30 years. And it'll be a real pity if we start closing our borders to the global economy and including to the Chinese economy. It just won't work. In fact, taking a longer historical view, India has always done much better when it has been opened rather than when it's been closed. And that was the case in earlier times as well. There are attempts, particularly in technology, in terms of telecommunication equipment, artificial intelligence, etc., of the world trying to keep China out. I don't think that's going to work, and I don't think it's advisable. There is, of course, also a certain kind of Western resentment against China's forays into foreign aid, which is kind of surprising because that's what they have been doing for as long as we can remember. But those are the natural tensions arising from this kind of change in the global economic weights. One thing I would like to also mention in the context of increasing weight of Asia is that to some extent, I think I'm correct in saying that the US has perhaps been excessive in terms of its focus on China, as opposed to Asia as a whole, not giving enough adequate attention to the rest of Asia. Meanwhile, Asia has been very busy building up a very dense network of institutions, actually somewhat analogous to Europe, although not as organized. One can mention Chiang Mai initiative, the RCEP, the CSN for central banks, the ASEAN +6 initiatives, the ASEAN Power Grid, and so on, and many others. So Asia is, apart from China, has been busy organizing itself, and therefore one of the issues I think for India is that we have kept out of almost all of these, if not all, and the most recent, of course, being, to my mind, a really erroneous withdrawal from RCEP. It is not in our interest, very clear to me, it's not in our interest, but I think that from India's point of view, that this emergence of Asia as a whole on the one hand, and this network of very dense institutions, we have been guilty of not joining these, we've been out of these, we've been much more Western inclined than Eastern inclined, even though we talk about an Act East policy, it ought to be our policy to engage much more closely with all these Asian institutions, including with China. My view is that India needs to see the writing on the wall, which I've talked about. Recognize, of course, most of all, our geographic location. We are in Asia, we're not in the Atlantic. Recognize our own magnitude of rising economic power. Post-COVID, I hope that will happen post-COVID within a year and a half or something like that. We do expect to grow 6-7% a year for the next 20 years, at least. We have to strive to engage much, much more with the rest of Asia in all areas: economic, trade, technical, higher education, medical, military, and everything. We have forgotten almost our cultural affinity with Southeast Asia, which is a long, long history. What are the challenges? Given China's dominance in most spheres, other Asian countries, including India, will have a very tough path ahead to be able to navigate this difficult future where we will be torn, we will be pulled in different directions by China and the United States. And both other Asian countries as well as us will have to negotiate this. We'll have to use our best diplomatic initiatives to be able to negotiate this. Um, and one example I do see is, after all, Japan, Korea, Taiwan all have their military strategic very high tensions with China, but that hasn't stopped them from the densest of economic linkages with China, um, and a major participation in the global value chain along with China. So I think the lessons for India here are that we have had to react in all kinds of ways in response to the Chinese incursion of last year, but we have perhaps overdone it. We have to get over that particular incident and hope build bridges again with China. But more importantly, that to have a way of dealing with different issues in different ways, particularly on the economic side. I had the privilege of chairing joint study groups with Singapore for the strategic, for the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, same thing with Sri Lanka, even a joint study group with China in the mid 2000s. So I think these things are possible through discussion and dialogue, as again Professor Jha emphasized. And it is really important for India to pursue a path that reflects our own destiny, our own increasing economic might, that allows us to exercise our strategic autonomy, which we've always exercised since independence. Of course, we have to protect our interests in every sphere while deepening our economic engagement with the rest of Asia, including China. Um, we have in the last 15 years or so at different times done a Singapore Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, an ASEAN FTA, a SAARC FTA, a Korea Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, and so on. So there are building blocks to what we can do, but as I said earlier, we need to do much more. And first of all, re-enter RCEP, re-enter negotiations for RCEP, and other organizations, institutional mechanisms in Asia. Let me conclude by talking a minute or so on global economic governance, which is relevant for Asia. Until recently, I think the world has done very well by following a rules-based global economic governance paradigm underpinned by the WTO, the IMF, the WTO, WIPO, etc. Huge erosion has taken place in all these institutions over the last 4 or 5 years, if not longer. All of them need strengthening. In this context, I must say that President Biden has moved amazingly swiftly in almost all areas in both domestic and foreign policy, but to my regret, not much in this area of global economic governance and in terms of US greater engagement as always had with these international economic governance institutions. So we need to do so soon. The WTO has a dynamic new Director General, so this is a good time for the US to re-engage WTO. I'm sure President Zelik, I'm saying President because that's how I knew him in the World Bank. President Zelik will have something to say as a former USTR on this. But the point sort of is that as the US engages more with these to rebuild these institutions, what has to be kept in mind is that it will not work unless Asia in particular, along with other emerging and developing economies, have a much, much greater say in their economic governance. Otherwise, if that is not done, if the emerging Asian economic power is not recognized adequately, Asia will go its own way, as it has been by forming the AIIB, Chiang Mai, which might become Asian Monetary Fund, RCEP, etc. And so I just wanted to put that in, that the new geoeconomics of Asia is also connected with global economic governance. It's important to reorganize institutions in terms of governance to recognize the rising power of Asia. So let me conclude. 1, global economic weight is shifting to Asia. 2, this will intensify the next 20 years. 3, the world has to recognize this and adapt. this chain in an organized, systematic fashion. And 4, most importantly, from my perspective, that India has to recognize that we are part of Asia and that we must recognize that and take advantage of what's happening in our neighborhood and engage much more intensely with the rest of Asia. Thank you, Tessie, for your patience, and thank you everyone for your patience.
Thank you very much, Rakesh. You've given us a lot to get started with. I'm now honored to introduce Yu Hongjun, and I apologize if I've mispronounced your name, Director General of the China Center for Contemporary World Studies and Vice Chairman of the Chinese People's Association for Progress and Peace and Disarmament. He is also a former Vice Minister of the International Department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and a former ambassador to Uzbekistan. And the floor is yours, sir.
I'm
so honored and very happy to participate in such a high-level conference, multilateral conference. And just now, the Chinese moderators and the American moderators delivered a very good speech, and Mohan and delivered a very good speech about the relationship, diplomatic relations. I really agree with him for what he mentioned. For example, we need to strengthen our relationship with the neighboring countries, the cooperation with the neighboring countries in order to safeguard the Asian peace and the stability. So what I really want to mention is about the Sino-Indian relationship against the backdrop of the pandemic. We know that as the neighboring two countries, civilized Asian countries, China and India are the two largest developing countries with the population of more than 1 billion. These two countries are the very important driving force for the economic development, and also our two countries are the very important driving engine for the promotion of the multipolarization and economic globalization. China and India have the huge potential of the cooperation and extensive common interest. Our two sides just showed the great responsibility of improving people's livelihood, accelerating the development. In the international arena, we shouldered the responsibility of promoting and safeguarding developing countries' common interest and promoting the world multipolarization development. And this just basically demonstrates that we have the similar stance in a lot of the major issues in the world. Therefore, China and India should be the partners and the friends rather than the rivals or the threats. Our two sides should just work together to promote each other's development rather than competing with each other. I think we need to strengthen our cooperation rather than just avoiding each other's development. So this is my personal experience. At present, like Dr. Mohan mentioned, India is facing a new round, a new wave of the pandemic. And basically, it brought the huge influence and impact to all of us. We really just feel very sorry and concerned about the pandemic in India. On April 30th, President Xi Jinping just delivered the greetings and the condolences to the Prime Minister Modi and pointed out that the human beings need to form the community of common fate. Only when we unite together and work together can we defeat the pandemic. China is willing to work together with India to fight against the pandemic and provide the assistance and support for India. In the same day, the Foreign Minister Wang Yi just also had a phone call with the Foreign Minister, the Xu Jie, and just said that China is totally willing to work with India and can feel the sorrow and the sadness of India and is willing to provide the support and assistance. Chinese Red Cross and the local government, as well as the non-governmental organizations and the enterprises already just provide the assistance for India. China sincerely hope and believe that Indian government and people could totally win this battle of fighting against the pandemic. And Wang Yi mentioned that China is willing to provide the following measures and support. Firstly, China will continue to support the Chinese enterprises to accelerate its production and provide the assistance and resources for the India to fight against the pandemic. Secondly, it is willing to provide any convenience for transporting those resources of fighting against the pandemic to the India. And thirdly, China is willing to organize the two countries, the hygiene and the pandemic fight experts, to hold the video conferences in order to share experiences and effective ways of fighting against the pandemic. And Chinese, the ambassador to India, Sun Weidong, pointed out that according to the statistics of the Chinese customers, since the April this year, China provided more than 5,000 ventilators for India, as well as the oxygen making machines to India, which reached more than 21,569. And also they provided more than 21.48 million masks and more than 3,800 tons of the drugs to India. The practices in the global fight against the pandemic demonstrates that all the human beings are in the community of common fate. Only when we work together and united together can we defeat this crisis. There are a lot of the global challenges of the human beings in the world. We have to work together globally and cooperate with each other. Dr. Mohan also mentioned India is trying its best to promote the vaccination. We sincerely hope that India could gain the bigger progress and control this pandemic. We will continue to support the WHO's important role in fighting against the pandemic to promote the construction of the community of common fate and promote international community to win the battle of fighting against the pandemic of COVID-19. I think China and India could strengthen their cooperation in this aspect. In terms of the bilateral economic development, what I really want to express that China and India are two large developing countries and emerging economies in the world. We have the strong complementarity in the economic development with huge potential of the cooperation. Since the modern times, with the globalization development, the economic development of our two countries are very rapid. And as the two largest developing countries in the world, China and India have the similarities and the complementarities in the industrial structures. And also we have the very similar development in terms of our industrial development. So we have the very similar industrial structures. As the second largest trading cooperation partner of the India, in the year of the 2019, Sino-India bilateral trade already been more than the 639.52 billion RMB. The export volume from China to India reached more than 515.63 billion RMB, taking up 2/3 of the total volume between the two countries. The import volume of China from India reached around the 123.89 billion RMB. At the same time, in China, we have a lot of the enterprises setting up their factories, companies, R&D centers, operation centers in India, which just dramatically promoted economic development and job employment in India. In the year of the 2020, last year, when we are under such a very complicated conditions brought by the pandemic, the Sino-India bilateral trade volume reached around 87.6 billion US dollars, and is reduction basically this reduced a little bit, but this the reduction is totally lower than the total reduction of the Indians' trade with the other countries. And from the January to March this year, our bilateral trade volume reached around 27.7 billion US dollars, increasing 42.8%. Which is nearly 50%, which demonstrates our two countries' economic and trade cooperation has the huge potential and resilience in the global governance development. With the international patterns of forces changes, the developing countries and emerging countries participated in the global governance with a strong wish for the participation. This basically just pose the new challenges for the Western countries, which are the dominant countries in the global governance for so many years. In the multilateral cooperation fields, China and India basically took up 35% of the world's population and it contribute 45% of the total global economic development. I think that the cooperation between China and India basically plays the decisive role for the emerging countries to participate in the global governance and globalization. This is not the exaggeration, this is the fact. In safeguarding the free trade system, China and India should participate in the bilateral relationship and deeply participate in global value chain, expand Asian region's multilateral business and trade cooperation. They also need to take the opportunity of the WTO reform to uphold the principles of the multilateral free trade. As the beneficiary of the free trade system, China and India have the common interest and the consensus of the WTO reform. They need to further cooperate with each other to safeguard and develop multilateral free trade system. China and India should jointly take the reform for the existed international multilateral organizations and further promote the existing organizations to take the further reform and further participate in the global governance. In the international society and community, China and India could just work together with the other multilateral international organizations, including United Nations, World Bank, and IMF, etc., to further promote the reform. I think China and India are the very important participants of the BRICS organizations, etc. So with the international orders, multipolarized development, developing countries played a more and more important role in the global governance, particularly as the two largest developing countries in the world, China and India's cooperation should have more rights of the saying and speech when it's participated in the reform of the international multilateral organizations, which could also further promote the representation of all the developing countries. China and India should also deepen their cooperation in the environmental protection. For example, like Himalaya areas environment protection, it should consider it as the foundation to promote the sustainable development targets of the United Nations 2030.
Himalaya is both the border of China and also very important regions for the China and India. And both China and India should play their advantages and to keep working with each other to protect this region and to make due contributions in the global warming and all the other aspects, and make Asia as the starting point and promote all of the countries to for the better world and for the better living. So both China and India have thousands of years of communication and friendship. I still remember that in 2014, when paid a visit in India, President Xi Jinping went to the hometown of the Premier Modi of India, and also the temple, which is the destinations of the monk in Tang Dynasty, which has a high positions in the relationship between China and India. And President Xi Jinping has mentioned that both China and India are the big power in the world, and both countries should respect with each other and learn from each other and seek good friendship with each other. So both China and India should communicate with each other, cooperate with us through civilization, and could also promote the communications between different civilizations and different cultures. We can be a role model for the other countries. So now, when they are among the atmosphere of the strategic competition between China and the US, it's good for the India to be neutral. In other words, that is to say, India is always relying on strategic independence among the background of strategic competition between China and the US. But let's go back to the histories of the 5 principles of peaceful communication with each other. We know that the self-reliance is really hard to be pursued. And currently, how to maintain a balance between this China and US competition rather than being led by the values of one countries or to have entering the Cold War atmosphere is an important topic. And so I think this is a residue questions, problems from the past history that is not easily to be solved in the short term. But the border problem is not all about the problems between China and the US. In India, both countries could go pursue the foreign diplomacies and military means to communicate with each other, to realize the decoupling with each other at the border. This is really a good, happy occasions. So next, I think we need to strictly keep the agreements among each other, and both countries should keep in strict communication with each other and have a good management of their control, and to complete the scenarios in the border region and to avoid the happenings of any kind of conflicts. In the histories in the past decades shows that the conflicts emphasis and the strengthening would not help with the solving of the conflicts. And the borders conflicts is a reality. So every country should be serious with this issue. And the border issue is not the full picture of the bilateral relations between China and India. We need to handle the historical problems together. We need to stick to the principles of equal communications and managing districts, and we would avoid the escalations of the situation in the border to be a crisis, to be a conflict. All in all, I would like to wish that both India and China could go toward each other and to to bring together with these to have a good cooperation with each others and to bring more well-being for the both countries and peoples, and to make their due contributions for the peaceful development of the region. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yu. You've given us a lot to think about. And now I turn to our final panelist, Ambassador Robert Zoellick, who has so many titles, I hardly know which one to use, but since I'm old Foreign Service, I use the one from my tribe, so to speak. As you know, he has been the US Trade Representative. He has been the President of the World Bank. He has a long list of academic titles as well. And Bob, the floor is yours.
So I very much appreciate the invitation to be with all of you, and particularly with my friend Rakesh. I remember when he was Deputy Governor of the Bank of India, and he taught me some very valuable lessons about small farmers moving into the commercial side. Pleased to meet the Vice Minister, Yu, as well. And I want to thank you, Tezi, and Julia, Nick, Professor Jha, for all your work with this effort. I'll make 5 points to open. First, the pattern of trade was changing significantly before COVID. After the global financial crisis, the growth in trade started to slip below GDP growth, which it had not for decades before. Although the trade and services was growing about 60% faster than the merchandise trade. Supply chains were becoming less reliant on lower labor costs, more linked to digital platforms, which relied increasingly on higher skilled knowledge workers. We're seeing changes because of new technology, particularly 3D printing, that raised the prospect of a big shift from large batches of specialized components assembled over great distances, to manufacturing small customized batches at the purchaser's site. And as Rakesh noted, we're seeing very important shifts in regional trade patterns, particularly with area concentrations for autos, electronic components, computers. And the changes in Asia were especially striking. As China increased its domestic demand, it built its internal supply chains, it started to boost its share of intermediate goods, and began to climb up the technology ladder. But what was notable was that even before COVID, governments were falling behind in adapting trade policy rules and standards to match the changes. Second point, a year of COVID combined with the rapid technology innovation and adaptation has simply accelerated these changes. Supply chains focused more on resilience and risk management than simply on cost cutting. We've seen the advent of digital platforms, AI, blockchain and digital ledgers, additive manufacturing, robotics, and these are starting to push trade across new types of frontiers. Cross-border and digital services are growing exponentially. The Dubai Future of Trade report estimates that B2C e-commerce in 2020 reached $1 trillion, and it estimated that B2B e-commerce will grow 6 times larger. This meant that more labor services such as health, education, entertainment, legal, design are likely to become tradable. The cross-border trade of goods may slow or even fall, but the rules for digital transfers, IPR, digital services, will assume even greater importance. With the recovery, we're starting to see that commodity trade prices are rising, especially for minerals and some agricultural products. This is also going to lead to changes in infrastructure too, both traditional and digital, from ports to platforms and different adaptation of ports to different linkages. We're also going to see demand for more sustainable practices. Of course, this will be in the area of energy, but also related to COVID and biological security, including for wildlife trafficking. Third point, ironically, even though the US had led in creating the world trading system, and though China had relied on that system to achieve an historical economic transformation, both countries, the world's 2 largest, have undermined the world order of trade. Traditionally, the US, as the leading edge economy, had pressed for new rules to support novel services and innovation. President Obama lost interest in his first term, and then he concentrated on TPP too late in his second term. Trump turned to managed trade, targeted bilateral trade deficits, increased tariffs and barriers, abandoned TPP, and tried to disable the WTO. China under Xi Jinping strengthened the role and control of the party and state in the economy. It challenged principles of the international trading system, was slow to open markets to foreign competition, and punished countries through trade. My current list includes Australia, Bhutan, the Czech Republic, India, Japan, Norway, the Philippines, South Korea, Sweden, and Vietnam. This is bad for the trading system, and I think it's going to be bad for China. Interestingly, Japan stepped forward to save the TPP, and it was supported by other middle-ranking economies, but it struggled to expand standards and processes to keep up with the changes. In some areas, the European Union developed internal regulations that gained wider but not general acceptance, such as in data protection and privacy. As Rakesh noted, India remained an obstacle, as it has been in the WTO. It held back from the RCEP, and in fact is still struggling with its internal market. Fourth, an observation from this distance is that China's new policy of dual circulation will have both internal and external dimensions. I suspect that the increased focus on self-reliance is a reaction to both the pandemic and US threats of decoupling. It's interesting that the new 5-year plan expands the party's role in security, which one hadn't seen to the same degree in prior 5-year plans. Security for economics, politics, culture, society, ecology. For the first time, political security includes extraterritorial application of Chinese law. But it's also important, and many Westerners have not looked at this, that China's plan includes a very significant structural agenda on quality of life, technology priorities, moving from the poverty agenda to a broader rural development agenda, and the connection of the state-owned enterprises and private sector, which is an area where I still have large questions how that's going to work out. At the same time, China will be seeking to reshape the international trading system. It sees the international economy as a point of leverage, attraction, defensive, reducing vulnerabilities, and the punish. Been active with the RCEP, suggested interest with free trade agreements with Japan and Korea. Of course, there's Belt and Road, its WTO program, and even an interest in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Evan Feigenbaum at the Carnegie Institution made, I think, an interesting observation on China's two-track approach. One, China is working within the existing system, and as it does so, it pushes towards its norms, its interests, its people and positions. This really shouldn't be surprising, but the surprise during the Trump years was how the US backed away from that system. We'll now see changes in that. But there was a second track that would follow more of the traditional notion of China and the tributary state model. The Belt and Road is a good example of this, trying to provide benefits, but of course, with no criticism of China and certainly the Communist Party. This has led to some very serious problems of debt buildup in developing countries. I was just on a call yesterday with people from the World Bank and the IMF, and you're going to see this is, I think, an issue that's going to cause trouble in part because of the opacity, the lack of information, a lot of this debt. So I would call this globalization with Chinese characteristics. It certainly moves beyond trade, as we'll see with a digital renminbi agenda. China sees the long-term struggle in Marxist-Leninist terms. President Xi's speeches are very clear on this, but it can combine tactical flexibility and pragmatism with patience. Fifth and finally, US policy. My former boss, James Baker, when he was chief of staff to Ronald Reagan in 1981, said, "Mr. President, you have three priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery." Well, today, President Biden has a number one priority, which is COVID and economic recovery, and that will preoccupy. He also has a huge domestic agenda. What this would suggest is that the international activities of the United States would naturally extend to the transnational domestic topics that are the ancillary parts of the domestic agenda: global climate change, vaccines and biological security, immigration. His focus is to try to first rebuild ties with allies and partners. But trade is the missing piece of Biden's multilateralism, as Rakesh noted. It's a difficult domestic constituency, and he has a full agenda, which he's trying to balance across his broad base of his party support. He will keep his distance from TPP. There are some voices that are calling for a digital trade agenda, building off provisions in the USMCA, that's the new NAFTA, and the TPP. I think you'll see some attention to environmental goods and services and health supplies, and perhaps to deal with some disputes, such as those with the European Union. As for US relations with China, the administration inherited the negative momentum. And of course, there's a bipartisan distrust, particularly in the Congress. Secretary of State Tony Blinken, I think, summarized what would be the framework, which is competitive where it should be, collaborative where it can be, adversarial where it must be. But these are just phrases. So how would they be put into practice? So far, the administration has kept the tariffs. It's added firms to the entity list. It's added some sanctions, although it's paused a few. I think some on the foreign policy side would like a few off-ramps to lessen the risks of miscalculation. And of course, they recognize the need to work together to try to address transnational issues, particularly topics such as climate. But there will be an ongoing public and congressional focus on human rights, Hong Kong, forced labor, questions of Olympic boycotts. I don't think from the government, but certainly there'll be public pressure. And all these are going to require businesses to walk a very fine line. So a closing thought. I agree with the point that I think Rakesh has suggested, which is US policymakers haven't fully recognized the scope, the size, and the type of the Indo-Pacific economic transformation. Exports to the United States and the EU are still important, but this is a huge regional market that will have changes in trade and investment patterns, logistics, infrastructure, standards. I think Western businesses have been more alert to this than the government. On the other hand, Asians still have a difficulty distinguishing US government policies from private sector dynamism and innovation. And even when the government policies seem sluggish, the pace of private sector transformation is very fast. I've been spending more time in this area, and the examples are just mind-boggling. So just to give you, again, some reference points, we've all seen what happened in the energy market with the use of fracking and some of the venture capital in that space totally transform energy prices and markets over the past decade. But you'll see the same in the digital, you're seeing it in new types of vaccines. And of course, the real challenge is how do you take these innovations and apply them in new business models? And I've just been struck that over the course of the pandemic, that companies are moving even faster in these areas. So to conclude, I hope the governments recognize the benefits of cooperation, as Professor Xi mentioned. Of course, that involves US, China, but also India. I would say to Rakesh that I am struck that US firms, of course, constantly encounter problems with India. Every time they think they get an entry point, they run into obstacles. But they're going to be persistent because they see India as a market that they need to work with, especially given uncertainties with China. So I think one needs also to recognize that as part of the economic arrangements, one needs a constructive approach on the larger challenges of climate change, biological security, and development and growth beyond COVID. One question I would pose, particularly for Rakesh, is whether he has any insights on how he thinks the Indian government moving beyond COVID will seek to address some of the international issues that he's mentioned and that I have also encouraged.
Thank you, Bob. And Ambassador Zelik's final point brings us quite neatly to the question period. I am going to kick that off, but as you think about formulating your questions, what you need to do is to use the raise hand function. You click on the button that says participants, you find your name, and then you click on raise hand. If you're having trouble working that, send a chat with a question. I will try to monitor the chat. But let me start by taking Ambassador Zelik's question and turning it back on his two colleagues in speaking. It's a way of asking what happens next and how will the three countries that we're talking about here prepare for it. Rakesh, would you like to start first?
Thank you, Tessie, and thank you, Bob, and Mr. Yu Hongjian for your remarks. Very, very encouraging indeed. I was afraid you were going to ask me first on this question. Since I'm no longer in the government and heading an independent think tank, I can't really give much of an insight into the government's thinking. And particularly because since I came back from the US and from Yale in the US, which is last October, because of COVID, I have not ventured out of my house. So which otherwise one would have met many of the officials in the government, and one can't do that kind of discussion through Zoom. So I can only give you my hope, actually, if that's okay. Um, so what India, what the government is currently doing is much more of self-reliance, I'm afraid. We have somewhat reversed what we were doing for 25 years, starting 1991, and increased tariffs on a whole variety of products. Most of them are not large increases, but we have increased those tariffs. Second, that we have now started a new program, which is WTO consistent, of providing subsidies to certain announced industries, including foreign firms, and especially foreign firms, for setting up new capacity, and partly focused on exports. So those are the kind of directions we are currently going. My hope in some sense is that the fiscal constraints will restrain us from those kind of policies. And one issue I think that there is actually is that the Indian, and this is to do with this policy of putting tariffs as well as these subsidies, that the Indian real exchange rate has appreciated reasonably significantly because we continue to get the interest of foreign firms, like Bob Zedek was mentioning. And so there's a large flow of foreign exchange, basically through investments, both portfolio as well as FDI, which then appreciates the exchange rate. Now, it's difficult to manage that, particularly with the US pressure of not managing exchange rates. And so in some, and it's kind of interesting in that, to my mind, is having an opposite effect. That pressure to not manage the exchange rate, which we comply with, actually makes India more closed, because you then start doing these kind of things in terms of either tariffs and or subsidies. So what I do hope is that that as we go through COVID, which will cause us more problems and more fiscal problems as well, that we do start rethinking our economic strategy and be more open. And I would say that, as I was kind of hinting in terms of a policy towards China, that we need to, we should find ways and means, diplomatic and other initiatives, and possibly really, if the WTO system, if the WTO system gets more strengthened, that we operate that way in terms of protecting ourselves, what may be interpreted otherwise as unfair competition from China. And so that if the WTO gets strengthened, if the dispute settlement system gets strengthened, I would hope and wish that we can then have much more dense economic engagement with China, because that is in our interest. And particularly as China is moving is moving up in the technology ladder, which they will keep doing quite rapidly, that there is a huge opportunity here for moving Chinese investment into India for many of the products that are being exported from China. So as I said, I can only give you my hopes and wishes rather than what the government of India will do.
I am grateful for your hopes and wishes, and would ask Professor Yu if he has a brief comment to make on that same question. I'm going to be asking all of you to be brief because we have limited time, and so I want to make sure everybody gets to ask a question. Sir.
I would like to brief you, very brief. I really just totally agree with the Dr. Mohan. This is really very constructive ideas. China and India have the disputes in terms of the border issues, and this couldn't be solved in a relatively shorter period. This really just bring the influence to the people of our two countries, but we have to see our common interest of the development. We have the common desire to secure our border. as well as the secure the development of our two countries. As the two largest developing countries, we basically need to be harmonious with each other, because that will be very important for keeping the safe and the peace of the whole world. So I think we need to just put aside our disputes and try to seek for the common grounds and cooperation. And just now, Dr. Mohan just mentioned very good, and I really agree with you. I really just hope our two sides could further strengthen our communications of the think tanks. And right now, because of the pandemic, probably we can only have the video conferencing rather than the face-to-face communications, but I believe the pandemic will just disappear someday in the future. We need to just strengthen our communications in all the aspects, including the think tank communications. So within this field, we can just strengthen our mutual trust and mutual understandings. And this will be very important for the stable and the peaceful, harmonious development of our two countries. I sincerely believe that right now, our communications is not very enough. The netizens' emotions sometimes are not healthy, and that will just bring the negative influence to our two countries' development. I think what we have to do is try to promote the mutual trust and understandings, and to put aside the disputes so that we can have better development. So that's what I really want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Chen Fang, who writes, I'd like to ask Mr. Zellick, how will US sanctions against Chinese companies change in the future? In what areas will it continue to strengthen? Which areas will be liberalized? Ambassador Zellick?
So I would not expect significant changes. The focus will be on sanctions. I want to be careful with the words here. There's something in the security area called the entity list about export controls. So that's not really sanctions, that's a question of controls. I think in the technology area, you'll see a continued restriction and restraint. There may be a few cases such as their relook at the TikTok acquisition, or some of the discussions under the rules about audit firms. But I think in the technology area, there's going to be, if anything, intensification. Another, if you mean by sanctions, actions that targeting individuals for human rights or Hong Kong and others, I think those will continue. And in fact, I think this administration will focus on those more than Trump cared about. If you talk about the increase in the tariffs that were done, which is not sanctions, but it's just a series of justifications for raising barriers. My sense is that this administration is not a big believer in open markets. It'll be less overt protectionist than Trump's behavior was. But the politics for the Democratic Party and the constituencies that USTR Catherine Tai is worried about tend to be more supportive of barriers. I think you may see the resolution of some disputes, such as efforts with the EU, with the Airbus sort of Boeing issue. But Ambassador Tai had already said that for tariffs with China, that why would she give up leverage? Now, having said this, I think there are paths to reduce some of these barriers. I think there's areas of common interest. China, for its own reasons, as you probably know, has increased opportunities for asset management firms in the financial sector because China wants to add the liquidity and institutional depth in its marketplace. I personally believe that there are win-win solutions. So, for example, in intellectual property rights, the information I had, which is a little out of date now, but was that say up to last year, China's new intellectual property rights courts were finding for foreign firms about 85 to 90% of the time, but the penalties were too low. So I would negotiate higher penalties. On the forced technology transfer issue, which was a serious problem, was prohibited by the Working Party report when China joined the WTO, but companies were afraid to provide evidence. I think the way to deal with that would be to reduce many of the joint venture requirements. So I could see ways to do this, but my approach will probably be more open market and liberalizing than the administration. So I think as I mentioned, I think the approach that you'll see the administration working on is first with allies and partners. It would be smart to rejoin the TPP, but they won't. Where I am trying to urge them to find some ground along, again, the lines that Rakesh mentioned for the region as a whole, was I think you could probably make some advances in the digital area. The Singaporeans have discussed the possibility of something with Japan, South Korea, Australia, Vietnam, Singapore, US, Canada, Mexico, some of the other perhaps Latin American countries. But that is not the priority now of the US Trade Representative. That may change, but for now, I would expect that with the US-China economic relationship, I would look for a sort of management of differences approach as opposed to any great steps forward. The other area, which I've highlighted, is climate change. That's an area where I would expect you'll see the possibility for some cooperation. But here, Secretary Kerry will have to be careful because given the negative attitudes towards China in the Congress, he has to be careful that he's not seen as giving away other issues for the sake of the climate change topic. I would like to think biological security would be another one because these pandemics are not going away. You can see they're increasing in frequency, they're increasing in costs, and the virologists that I speak to kind of at a global level believe it's a connection of the wildlife to livestock to human transition. There's a big issue of that in South China and Southeast Asia. So there's a lot we can learn from this. Unfortunately, that's not the way that the international community has been dealing with it so far. But at some point, perhaps rationality will prevail. So Tezi, you're on.
Yeah. I see a raised hand from Anirban Das. Anirban, are you there? And do you have a question? And
yes, ma'am. I have a question directed towards Dr. Mohan and Professor Jia because they are the China and India perspective they have shared. So as I followed the discussion, what I feel is the challenge in the post-pandemic world is to invest in institution building in Asia. So we commit to a process. We have pragmatic regionalism as we saw in ASEAN with Muswara or consultation and Mufakat consensus that we saw in ASEAN. Yes, we do have regional cooperation institutions such as SAARC in South Asia, BIMSTEC, and ASEAN. But the overarching body that could bring the Asian members together for dispute settlement mechanism, for consensus on issues of mutual interest such as climate change, that is missing. So if we are to work in a post-pandemic world towards the development of such an institution, what should be the focus? What should we currently focus on if we are to reach that stage at some point in the future? Thank you.
Rakesh, would you like to tackle that first?
Yeah, well, I think that as Bob Zoellick was also saying, that climate change is an area where in some sense there is a broader international agreement amongst all players, not in detail certainly, but clearly on the objective. And this is an area where both China and India are both committed. And once again, as I was emphasizing earlier, that we tend to ignore the other Asian countries, which are also very large, whether it's Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, the Koreas, Thailand, and so on. That it does seem to me that in terms of building a more overarching institutional mechanism for greater cooperation and discussion on different matters, that could be a good starting point where there are fewer differences. There will, of course, as I said, be a lot of bargaining and a lot of discussion on exact targets and exact strategies and so on. But that may be a good starting point. I mean, in a sense, the way that the G20 started, which is essentially focused on economic and financial issues, and then after the 2007-8, what I always call the North Atlantic financial crisis, it expanded into other areas. So that could be taken as an analogy. And then, of course, ASEAN has all kinds of institutions to discuss these things. And I think that if there's an Asia-wide institutional innovation for climate change, that might then be the beginning of something larger.
An excellent idea. Now, Mr. Das wanted also to ask Professor Jia. Is Professor Jia still here?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. That's a great question. I think we have a number of institutions in the region already. I think we might as well make good use of them. One is APEC. Another is the Asia Summit, East Asia Summit, in which India is included, and also RCEP. I think these are institutions that we can make a better use of them. Of course, each institution has its own focus, but we may as well expand its focus to cover other things. It's the other thing is a matter of will. I think if we attach enough importance to certain issues, we can always overcome the obstacles and sit down and talk about them. The problem is whether we can overcome those obstacles. As far as for China and India, we have a border problem. I think as Mr. Yu said, China has made and also India have made a lot of efforts in the past year or so to try to manage the border problem, and also if we are successful, if we build enough confidence building measures in managing the border issue, then we can expand our cooperation in other areas. In terms of trade, we want India market. India wants China market. We want to have each other's market so that we can stay prosperous and competitive. So there are many things that we can work together. I don't see confrontation as the alternative. It's not an alternative. We have to work together in the best interest of our two countries. Thank you.
Thank you. James Zhang would like to ask a question.
Thank you, Ambassador Schaefer. Thank you, Ambassador Schaefer. My question relates to the IMF aid in light of the pandemic to both President Oleg and Dr. Mo. IMF, at the beginning of the pandemic, IMF offered the short-term liquidity loan for $50 billion, but no country takes it. And also the IMF, the board of IMF voted to to issue new $650 billion special drawing right. And my question to President Zoellick is that, are you surprised that Secretary Yellen reversed Trump administration's policy because Trump administration didn't want any country to use the special drawing right to pay off Chinese creditors? And my question to Dr. Mohan is that given the very limited allocation of the out of the 650 billion special drawing right, very little will be drawn by poor country, but only poor countries can use the special drawing rights. So do you think the SDR will be sufficient to aid the poor countries? Thank you.
Bob, would you like to take the first try at that one?
Sure. I want to put this question in context because I think it's an important one more broadly. And I'm reflecting a session I took part in yesterday with the World Bank's chief economist. What we're discovering is to truly have a recovery as opposed to just a rebound, it's going to have to include developing countries in the pandemic as well as developed countries. And that, of course, is partly a vaccine and health issue. But depending on the nature of the vaccines, how they're distributed, variations, and this, I think what some economists have referred to as the K-shaped recovery is going to be important to keep in mind. What I'm saying by K-shaped is that you've got an upper leg for some people and some economies doing quite well, a lower leg, they're going to be struggling. So this is attention to the developing economies in a way that was different than the global financial crisis, which after the initial hit, a lot of the developing countries actually did pretty well, in part because of China's expansionary program and the commodity prices that flowed from that. So the question then relates to what the multilaterals and others should be doing to help developing countries. The SDRs are an inefficient way of doing this. It would be better to focus funds directly for a lot of the developing countries. But since that's probably impossible to do, it's a second best solution. Now, as for the administration's willingness to do this, I think they're, on the one hand, they're being practical by treating it as a second best solution. But I think it is an example of where, in some ways, they reflect some inexperience, is that if I were Janet Yellen, I would have gone to Kristalina Georgieva and the IMF and said, look, I might be able to do this politically, but I need some help from China in dealing with the debt problems of a lot of the developing countries. As you probably know, China's agreed to restructure the Exim Bank debt, not the China Development Bank debt. The more the multilaterals are learning about the big debt buildup, there's a lot of restrictions that China's put on in terms of how to restructure. And even the restructuring is basically delays payments. It doesn't sort of reduce the rates or takes any cut. There are going to be some very big problems to deal with China on this. And I would have suggested that if quietly China could have moved on some of these issues and the US could have moved on the SDR, you actually would have had a better international response. Not that you're going to resolve all the China debt issues in one sweep, but I think you could have made progress. I highlight this because it's an example of what's not happening in the multilateral system. People aren't trying to figure out whether you could have win-win trade-offs in this process. And I'm also highlighting the fact that, you see, part of what happened was the multilaterals through various debt forgiveness schemes that Rakesh knows well really reduced the debt of the poorest countries quite significantly over the course of the 2000s. And China's loans have just rebuilt that debt problem. And as for the countries themselves, a lot of them are unwilling to take advantage of some of these procedures because they're afraid about their credit rating and their ongoing ability. So this is going to be an ongoing challenge for the nature of a serious recovery. Frankly, when I was in China a couple years ago and I was highlighting some constructive steps, this is one that I focused on. I said, you know, this is going to be a problem. You know, it's going to come back home to haunt you. Get ahead of it. Try to be transparent on the debt. Show your cooperative nature. And in some ways, it's, to be fair, it's got some similarities to the United States with the Latin debt crisis of the 80s. You could prolong it for a decade, or you could move more quickly to get a recovery.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zelik. We have time for one more question, and that is from Anusha Chari. Anusha, are you still with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for this great discussion. I just have a question about principles. Does self-reliance equal autarky? And are principles of self-reliance necessarily isolationist or protectionist? Or is there a way in which these principles can be leveraged to deepen global economic engagement? In other words, can principles of self-reliance be consistent with an outward orientation? Thank you.
Sorry, this is addressed to the group as a whole. And I think we're going to have to go straight from this to closing statements. So since Rakesh Mohan had an opportunity to discuss this a bit in his opening presentation, I'm going to ask Ambassador Zelik to tackle it.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. We should hear from Rakesh again on this, because this is this is a topic that he's struggled with over decades. But I think the short answer is that self-reliance can become a policy of resilience that could have constructive aspects to it. It's a political reality in many countries. But I am wary, given most countries' political systems, that it quickly gets manipulated to move towards the autarky that you discussed. Rakesh knows there's a long history of this with import substitution schemes going back to the 60s and 70s that didn't pay off very well. And I'll just share my own political experiences that in the US political system, there's no shortage of people that say, oh, we have to have the ability to produce this, that, and the other thing. I would suggest you to transform the question a bit from self-sufficiency or autarky versus total openness to a resiliency concept. So resiliency might suggest that you're not just relying on one supply. So if we're worried about the control, for example, of particular minerals that China has had a chokehold on, not surprisingly, you're probably going to want to have a few other sources of those minerals. And I think you're seeing this with companies. And frankly, this is one of the advantages that India has. As China becomes a more troublesome market for US and European companies, they're looking to ASEAN and others, but India strikes them as a long-term play. So I would focus a little bit more on the resilience idea than on the self-sufficiency. But I'm partly giving you a political economy answer, which is that the self-sufficiency argument can easily be manipulated to form every type of protectionism, and will be, unless people argue for the continued benefits of openness.
Thank you. And Rakesh, do you have a very quick addition to make to that?
Yeah, very quickly. Obviously, basically my remarks are similar to Mr. Zelik's. that obviously in principle, self-reliance does not mean self-sufficiency and autarky. But we have to recognize that that's how that slogan has been interpreted most of the time. Another way that I would look at self-reliance is that where you don't, I mean, in some sense, you're self-reliant when you don't need a great amount of aid to exist or to grow. And in some sense, it is after India opened up that indeed we had between 6.5% and 7% annual growth for about 30 years since the early 1990s, with foreign aid becoming almost irrelevant, just about irrelevant. And what has happened during this time is that as incomes grew, so did savings, and therefore domestic savings that have indeed fueled the growth story that that most of our investment could be financed by domestic savings. So in some sense, much greater openness made us much more self-reliant, and foreign aid became very small. Of course, important in some areas, but overall, in a macro sense, not important. So I think I would say, in principle, self-reliance does not mean self-sufficiency and autarky, but you, just as Bob Zelig is saying, that you have to really guard against what people think it means and what people think it is being used to do, to justify certain kinds of measures which close the economy in some respects.
Thank you very much. And now I'm very sorry, but we're going to have to bring this session to an end. I would like to say that this discussion has really set us up very well for the next seminar in this series, which will talk about overcoming strategic mistrust. And I would like you all to think about that, because we can have a very interesting discussion on that in about a month's time. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Zhao Suisheng from the University of Denver, Executive Director of the Center for Chinese American Cooperation and founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Contemporary China. Professor Zhao. Is Professor Zhao here? Then I think
No, probably he's not here.
Thank you. Professor Wang will speak.
Sure.
Professor Wang Dong from Peking University.
Yes. Thank you, Tezzy. I'll be very brief here. First, I'm so glad to see so many old friends and the new ones as well at today's webinar. And I would like to begin by thanking Ambassador Platt, Professor Jia, for their very illuminating opening remarks, and also Dr. Rakesh Mohan, Minister Yu, Ambassador Bob Zolik for making the three very important, thoughtful keynote speeches. And of course, Tezzy, thank you so much for your excellent job of moderating the whole session. I think I'm really encouraged by, and I would like to also second Tezzy by saying that I think today's discussion really had laid a very solid ground for us to continue to move forward to our fourth session in about a month. So I'm particularly encouraged and impressed with the kind of positive sum way of thinking I think all our participants has demonstrated in today's discussion. And also I understand there are many distinguished participants, including senior practitioners, leading scholars, and in fact, a lot of senior representatives from business communities from both China and the United States. You have been listening and also engaging very proactively in this discussion. So thank you. And finally, I'd like to thank all the staff members whose hard work has made today's event possible. So, I will say very much look forward to our next discussion. So I will leave more substantive comments to my friend Tim Stratford.
Tim Stratford, Chairman Emeritus of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. You will have the last word today.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Schaefer. I also appreciate the opportunity to join really such a distinguished set of speakers and to make a few closing comments on behalf of the 1,000 or so companies that are members of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. Our topic tonight has focused on economic relations between the United States, China, and India. Interpreting that topic quite literally, from the perspective of American companies, it's actually very hard to picture business arrangements that are specifically involving these three countries together. This is because of the geopolitical tensions between the US and China, between China and India, and also, frankly, because of India's reputation as a rather difficult place to do business. Historically, almost every major foreign investor that has plants or equipment in India is in India for the Indian market. And virtually no one invests in India to export physical goods to third countries, although there are important exceptions, and that's starting to change. I think the most important exception may be pharma with respect to active ingredients, generics, vaccines, and medical devices. So of course, this may create some special opportunities given the pandemic. But still, most American companies would rather trade with India than invest in India. Now, services, particularly IT and business process outsourcing, one of the areas that Ambassador Zellick mentioned, they're another story, and that's a sector where India excels. But fortunately, the good news is that the business climate in India is slowly improving. And just this week, India and the UK announced an enhanced trade partnership that should involve lower trade barriers. And the EU and India announced that they would begin FTA negotiations. And it's also true that US-China competition and global trends may create opportunities for India. After all, India is already the third or fourth largest economy in the world by PPP. And unless outside factors intervene, India will likely be the third largest economy in nominal terms in the coming decade. Also, prior to the pandemic, India's economy was about 10 to 15 years behind China in nominal GDP terms, which suggests that India may be primed for a period of growth similar to what we've seen in China when it reached that level of development. So India will need to significantly improve the business climate to take advantage of these opportunities, but one can imagine types of opportunities for American companies to expand business with India. As a starting point, supply chain diversification. As India's investment climate improves, more US firms will consider it a viable location for investment designed to diversify supply chain risk. And some of this may come as people try to diversify risks associated with having so much of their supply focused from China. Also, with respect to labor-intensive manufacturing, India's large skilled workforce could make it a magnet for firms looking to relocate manufacturing operations out of China, where labor costs have been rising significantly. Also, in medical and pharma, as mentioned, India is very competitive in this area, and this presents some special opportunities. Now, India-China competition also presents other opportunities that can benefit South and Central Asia. South and Central Asia have traditionally relied on economic ties with India for economic growth, but as China is becoming increasingly active in South Asia with its investments in manufacturing, industrial parks, and infrastructure, competition with India is heating up, and countries like Nepal, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives could benefit from this. And also, as strategic competition between China and other regions increases, those regions will look for ways to balance China's dominance in trade and manufacturing. And India is the one country in Asia with the potential to eventually counterbalance China. And that's probably one reason why the EU and UK want to deepen trade and investment with India. So it will be up to India to take the difficult steps needed to reform and open its economy to take advantage of this. But I think these shifting dynamics between the United States, China, and India do present some opportunities. I agree with Ambassador Zelek's statement when he said that he hopes that the governments can recognize the benefit of cooperation. And this applies to all three of our governments, the United States, China, and India. We hope also that these governments can make progress in creating a more predictable and a fair environment for doing what we do best as companies. And as this happens, we look forward to contributing to economic development and relationship building in the region. And finally, I do also want to offer our condolences and best wishes for the people of India who are enduring such a terrible ordeal. And we hope all the best for the people of India. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim Stratford. And thank you to all those who joined us here. I understand that there's going to be a group picture, so stay at your Zoom stations for just a few more minutes, and then Trenton will tell us when the cameras have clicked.